Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Meg Bouvier. You know me as the creator of your library of NIH grantsmanship courses. I have nearly 40 years of experience at NIH as an applicant, an intramural researcher, a staff writer, and now as a full-time NIH grant mentor. I've helped clients land almost $600 million in federal funding, and I'm here to answer your NIH grant writing questions. So grab a cup of coffee and let's get started. So if you're attending live, just a reminder that you are in listen-only mode. You can begin to load up the Q&A box with any questions that you have. And if you're watching this as a recording, and I think the bulk of our viewers at this point are watching this as a recording, this is a reminder that it's August 6, 2025, and things are changing at breakneck pace at NIH these days. So just make sure that anything that we say is still true when you're implementing it. What you should be viewing in the library right now, well, I would hope that if you're targeting an October deadline, that you're closing in on the finish line of watching your courses. Hopefully you're finishing up, if you're writing an R series application, you're finishing up with chapter 4 of Master the R series, and getting ready to iterate drafts with your colleagues and polish it up and get going. In terms of updates in the library, I just finished recording an update to Master the R series, so that should be coming out probably in the next week or two. It does have quite a few updated slides with new examples of different sections, and all of the new policy changes that have been coming out are reflected in that as well. Any NIH updates? My goodness. Well, I'm going to talk about that with our guest because there are a lot of them and he may want to weigh in as well. Anybody who would like to share information with us in any way, shape, or form, you want to suggest a guest, you want to suggest a topic, you want to share how you're using our membership resources with us, anything you want to communicate with us about, feel free. Just email me at meg@bouviergrant.com. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest today, Dr. Burr Zimmerman. Burr and I go back to, we always struggle to come up with the number. I want to say maybe 2007 or 8 we started working together. And I have the utmost respect for Burr as a grant writer. There's probably, if I had a large format grant application where I needed help, Burr's probably the only other person I would ask for help. I really, my respect for him is boundless. And he's a personal friend, and I just adore him as a person. So I'm always delighted when Burr comes on. You are probably my oldest grant writing colleague. So welcome, Burr.
Thank you so much. Very, very kind words, Meg. And I feel the same way. I'm really privileged and honored to be here today. Today's topic, as you mentioned, is really about this era of rapid change that we're in right now. And what are some practical ways we can manage and live within this world of change? And so I tried to come up with a sort of cheeky title. So not newsflash, you still need to align your research to agency priorities as they change. As Meg said, my name is Burr Zimmerman. I'm a principal consultant with Urban Venture Group. I do a lot of NIH, but not exclusively NIH proposal support. I've got clients in a range of areas, whether it's health, defense, materials, energy, etc. And I work with lots of different kinds of clients, faculty, whether new faculty, mid-career, large centers, entrepreneurs, hospitals, etc. My clients have raised a little over $1.1 billion in proposal wins. That's a big number that we're really proud of. And my background is a PhD in chemical engineering. All right. Well, today's topic, we are in a uncertain and changing funding landscape, and there's funding cuts, there's changing agency priorities, there's opportunities being reduced in scope. And as researchers, what can you do? I've had many, many clients come to me with fear, anxiety, uncertainty. And so what I wanted to talk about today is, well, first of all, I want to validate those feelings But I also want to talk about practical things. What can we as researchers do to continue to maximize our chances of funding success? And I want to speak to that elephant in the room. So many of my clients are expressing concern and fear, and concerns about political dynamics, concerns about funding rules changing, and a feeling like you're unable to plan in the long term. And today, I can't fix a lot of those feelings, but what I do want to do is give you some practical suggestions for how to continue to be successful in writing proposals that are responsive to agency priorities. So we can't control the funding landscape, but we can control how we respond to it. And so we are working in an era of rapid changes. And the core message today is your success is going to depend on staying aligned with agency priorities and making sure that you stay aware of agency rules as they evolve. This is true beyond NIH as well, and this is not new. Those of you, it sounds like many of you are already existing clients of Meg's. One of the great things Meg does is she sends out updates. Hey, this is changing. And she's been doing that for years. And so one message today is, this isn't new. Your need to stay informed, to stay flexible, to stay adaptable was true a year ago. It was true 5 years ago. It was true 10 years ago. Another point that I want to emphasize is it's even more important in an era like now to maintain and strengthen relationships with agency staff. And it's really essential to frame your research in terms that align with agencies and the impacts they're intending to have. There are new selection processes, there's new merit criteria, there's new reviewers potentially, and how you frame your research is going to depend on who they are. So we're going to talk in practical terms, some things you can do. Okay, so as I said, agency funding priorities shifting isn't new. Maybe it's more rapid now, but they've always been changing. And the first, I guess, observation I'll make it is your job to align with what the funders want. And so step one is to think beyond your own viewpoint, think beyond your own science, think beyond your own framing. So what does that mean? Always seek to learn agency goals, understand their review process, and understand who the reviewers are. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. Seek to align your proposal with those agency priorities and merit criteria. This sounds very basic, but I have many, many clients who have said things like, well, I want my science to speak for itself, or, the goals are obvious. I don't need to explain them. I don't need to explain why the science would have benefits beyond simply moving back the horizon of science. And so you should explain how your work supports that agency mission and how the science will achieve outcomes that matter. And it's possible you might need to add more funding sources to your repertoire. So what does it mean to reframe your research? So reframing doesn't mean you have to change what your research is or what your core research purpose is, but it might mean you're adjusting your messaging. A few basic and frankly commonly overlooked suggestions. First, emphasize stakeholder benefits. For an NIH audience, who does this mean? Certainly it means patient impact. It might mean clinician impact. It might also mean impact on fellow researchers. So connect your work to who else cares and why they might care. Increasingly, you should also emphasize broad societal benefits, whether that's public health, economic or innovation benefits, health resilience. Why would Congress care about your research? And of course, try to avoid picking fights and avoid unnecessary controversy. Be mindful when you're addressing sensitive topics such as DEI or climate change. It doesn't mean you shouldn't ever mention them, and it doesn't mean there aren't benefits to doing research in those areas. But you should be mindful about avoiding unnecessary controversy. One thing that is new, so I just got done telling you that, this isn't new. But one thing that is new is that we're seeing more what I would call centralized reviews. Funding agencies are increasingly relying on centralized reviewers or agency staff rather than peer review or field specific experts. We're seeing, and I'll let Meg talk about specifics of specific NIH review processes, but we're seeing the peer review being less governing of funding decisions. We're seeing agency staff members selecting from a broader array of funding programs beyond simply those that scored the highest. We're also seeing non-expert reviewers playing a stronger role in funding decisions. And so you need to be aware that reviewers may not be specialists in your discipline. Now, of course, those of you who are very experienced in NIH are probably well aware and well versed in looking at your study section or special emphasis panel and looking at its composition. For example, you might have a panel that is primarily scientists, or you might have a panel that's primarily clinicians, and you might need to write your application for that audience, either emphasizing clinical or emphasizing scientific. And so be aware, whether it's NIH or obviously Department of Defense has a lot of health research as well. There may be non-scientist or non-clinician agency staff, or they might involve scientists from more distant disciplines. So what does that mean? Try to limit jargon or at least explain terminologies. That's always a good practice. Favor plain language. What does that mean? If your language can be understood by a non-expert and still be technically accurate, that is favorable. And of course, define those acronyms on first use. I think during periods of rapid change, strategic engagement with agencies is all the more important. Stay informed across multiple agencies, and you might need to expand your look beyond just NIH. There are many other health funding agencies that you might need to be aware of. If you stay informed, it will help you spot new opportunities. It will help you stay abreast of priorities as they're shifting and understand broader funding trends. And that may help you find new funding opportunities or better align with the ones that you typically go to. So, how do you engage with a new agency? Sometimes new researchers find this very intimidating. So my goal is to make this feel practical and possible. Those of you who are more experienced, it may have been a while since you've had to do this. You might know the folks already. So if you are going to reach into a new agency, what are some best practices to do that? Well, step one is what I call do your homework. Agencies publish information, whether it's their websites or newsletters or email distributions. Use that agency published information to learn about their mission, their priorities, stay abreast of what they have been funding, understand if key personnel are changing, maybe topic areas are changing, but do your homework. Make sure you know what they are saying publicly. Step two is have introductory materials about your research prepared, a specific AIMS page, for example. Make sure that AIMS page, if it's for a specific, say, R01, many of you will know how to do that. Obviously, Meg's training materials offer tremendous advice on how to do that. You may also want to have a one-pager that describes your research program rather than being project-specific, but have those introductory materials available. Make sure you have materials that describe not only a specific project, but your unique skills. Maybe you have unique equipment or a unique team. Try to demonstrate your awareness of those agency priorities in that one-pager. Talk about how your research aligns with that agency or institute goals. So that when you do reach out to the agency, when you do reach out to, say, contact a program manager, or when you attend an agency event, you have that information ready. And I think it's always a good idea to seek to collaboratively define a fundable project. What does that mean? When you're talking with program staff, seek input from them, seek to align and ask them how well you align with whatever their goals, funding priorities, gaps that they know of. Sometimes researchers think when they talk with program staff, it's their job to talk a lot, right? To just show how smart and how well organized and how thoughtful their research project is. It's my opinion that you should seek to make that conversation collaborative. Talk less, listen more, and really invite that program or program manager or staff member to share their feedback. And what part of that is to ask questions that elicit that feedback. And why do you want to do that? Well, program officers can be incredibly helpful allies. NIH, as many of you know, it is the program manager's jobs to talk with you. That's not true in every agency. But most agencies have folks whose job it is to talk with you, and nurturing relationships with them can not only help you transactionally in your immediate application that you're preparing, but also can enhance your long-term funding success. One of the things we're seeing is that program officers can influence or even directly select projects for funding. Like I said, there's a little bit of a shift away from a more pure peer review process toward a more program or agency priority directed funding selection process. But beyond program officers simply advocating or championing your project, POs can convey unpublished information. They can alert you to unpublished or not yet published upcoming opportunity. They can advocate internally for your project. Now, there are rules, and Meg, you can probably talk more about the specific rules in NIH, but in other agencies, they certainly can advocate and will advocate for the projects they want. And they can relay or clarify strategic priorities, especially as they're emerging. And so what does that mean? The relationships you have, the long-term, the non-transactional relationships you can develop with POs will allow you to gain learnings that you could not otherwise access. And in my opinion, this insight into how agencies think and how agencies fund projects is essential. It's irreplaceable. Going back to the kind of the main thesis of today's talk, we are working in an era of rapid change, and your success depends on staying aligned with agency priorities, but this isn't new. So stay informed, stay flexible and adaptable, really seek to strengthen your relationships with agency staff, and be mindful of how you frame your research. Frame it in terms of agency priorities and impact. Impact, whether that's scientific impact or clinical impact or public health or patient impact. Keep in mind that the selection processes, the criteria, and the reviewers might be different than you expected. So really intentionally look to see who might be reviewing your proposal and make sure you write for them, especially if they're not a specific expert in your field. All right. Meg, is that a good amount of content and time? Should we switch to questions?
Well, actually, so I was taking notes while you were talking because I have a lot of, it kind of dovetails with some of the news that's been coming out of NIH lately. So this was fantastic because I think this is exactly right. And, like when we're in a period of change, and Burr, you and I have been around long enough to remember a lot of different changes in NIH, like going from the 25-page R01 to the 12-page R01 and changing the scoring criteria to align with the instructions, and like the new change in scoring criteria that have just, like, we've seen lots and lots of changes. This is arguably the most profound change this year that we have seen across agencies, not at NIH. But what we both understand as people who have been in this field for a long time is that if you keep your head and don't panic, change can represent opportunity. And I think that is the take-home message of this talk. And I probably, people got sick of me bobbing my head up and down as I was looking at these slides, because there is opportunity here, because a lot of people are panicking and won't be able to adapt to the change. So our goal, and I say this at the end of every one of these sessions, you guys are doing important work and you have many people on the sidelines, people like Burr and me, your RD and pre-award support people who are cheering you on and want to help you in any way we can. And this is one of the ways, one of the very important ways that we can help is to help you figure out the rapidly changing priorities and policies at these agencies. So one of the things that I wanted to say was you had a slide that said if you're approaching a new agency, these are the things you should do. Familiarize yourself with, engaging with the new agency. I would argue on some level, they are all new agencies. So you might have a 20-year career with NIH. It is a new agency now, and you need to start over. And you need to really kind of familiarize yourself with what's happening and think about how to adapt to that. And I'm not talking about, and my apologies to people who are thinking, I'm never going to get the kind of work I do funded at NIH right now, which may be true. That I don't mean to minimize or, this is a broad brushstroke. It's not going to apply to everybody. However, with my clients, what I'm finding is that sometimes the work remains the same, but how we write the narrative overview of the specific aims and how we write the significance and innovation sections, that's the part that's changing. And one of the things that I keep trying to emphasize for people is that you're not going to pitch your research as, we're addressing underserved populations, we're addressing health disparities, where you might be addressing things like we're reducing cost by addressing, right, reframing, exactly right. We're going to reduce cost by looking at a patient cohort that is disproportionately affected by this disease and trying to figure out how to reduce the cost of treating the burden to society, the cost to insurance companies of treating that demographic. So it's not a different project. It's a different framing of that project. So spot on with that. The other thing is in terms of building relationships with program officers, that is also in a state of flux. And I do want to caution people that while the program officers, they remain people who are MDs, PhDs, or both who have expertise in the science, there are fewer of them. And that a lot of institutional memory is being lost right now because there are a lot of veteran program officers who have retired or retired. So some of that is being lost. It may be harder to get a hold of a program officer. And often I'm finding that clients who are able to get a hold of the program officer, they're honestly saying we ourselves simply don't know what is happening with this NOFO, for example. Whatever it might be. We don't know if this RFA is going to be renewed. We don't know if the CATS R01 is going to be renewed. We don't know, we're getting these, they legitimately don't know. But nevertheless, you need to at NIH, that's an agency where it is important to build that relationship.
Meg, can I jump in?
Yeah.
So I want to share a few experiences from outside NIH, especially in non-NIH HHS agencies and DoD health agencies. I think what Meg said is still true. I think for those agencies, it's still true that program officers sometimes don't know or are finding out late or finding out when we find out, and that uncertainty is still there. Absolutely, we're seeing program officers that are newer to the agency. They don't have those years or decades of experience. They're transitioning to newer folks, so we're seeing turnover and changeover. I would argue that maintaining strong relationships with program officers is even more important, not because they know the answers. They may not know the answers, but they can keep you abreast of the information more rapidly, and that is helpful, essential, advantageous to you. And so what I'm seeing, I do a lot of work in other HHS agencies besides NIH as well, and what I'm seeing there is first of all, I love my program officers. I'm friends with them too. It's not transactional for me, but they're telling me, hey, here's what I've heard. Here's what we don't know. We've got a meeting coming up in 2 weeks. And that's really useful information that I can relay to my clients. I'm giving them the absolute best and most current information information possible and available. And even though they don't know the answers, even though they can't say, oh, it's going to be this, Meg said there's an opportunity, and I agree with that. You don't have to know all the answers, but if you can know better answers or better information than who you're competing with, you'll still have an advantage. And that's what we're playing here, the differential advantage game. You're not going to make your funding chances 100%, but if you can make your funding chances higher than who you're competing against, then that's the goal.
Right. And that's definitely always been the case at study sections. The applications are ranked. So you're always you are receiving a numeric score, but then you are ranked against the people in your cohort who have applied at that cycle, at that study section. So it is a relative to your peers. So the more you can get on top, don't be engulfed by the tidal wave. Get your damn surfboard up on top of it and start surfing it as best you can to stay afloat. So, and again, I don't mean to, I know there are people who are really really struggling to figure out how to adapt to the changes. And this is a broad brushstroke. It's not going to work for everybody. But I would say that most of the people who are coming to me for advice, there is a way that they could pitch this to make it work better without extensively changing their scientific direction.
So, Meg, I want to also capture something that you said a minute ago, too, and really emphasize it. Here we go. So your core research might stay the same, but how you articulate the benefits might change.
Right.
And Meg talked about the societal benefits, the economic benefits, the cost savings. Very simply, the way you articulate DEI type benefits does need to change. But that doesn't mean that you can't continue to do research that is aware of how different folks are affected by different interventions. But it might be as simple as, instead of saying we're going to understand how this specific underserved group is affected, you might say we're going to make sure that we understand well how all groups are affected. And here are some of the gaps. And it's like, it's the same research, but it's just a slightly different word. And so, and I'm not trying to oversimplify. Reframing isn't always that simple. But the point is, you may have to change your core research, but you may not. And that's part of what Meg and I do for a living, is saying, okay, what is our best shot here? But I don't want to downplay that for some folks the changes are major changes might be necessary. But I also want to point out that think in these terms and see if you can find ways that aren't quite so profoundly different for you.
Right. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit is review and how review is changing. And so you rightly pointed out that several times that the scoring criteria have changed. People are familiar with that, I think, at this point. We've now had 2 cycles of that, and now we've gotten in the last few weeks the first batch of summary statements coming out that have the new scoring criteria. So we're getting a sense of what that looks like. But some of the things that are changing at the agency level are that review is being consolidated in the Center for Scientific Review. So once upon a time, way back in the olden days, everything was reviewed at the institutes. And Burr and I remember a time when a lot more applications paper applications were reviewed at institutes. That's how old we are and how long we've been doing this. Now there's the sense that in their infinite wisdom, they did an audit on the number of hours it takes to conduct a review in an institute versus at CSR. And they decided that it's cheaper and more efficient to do it at CSR, right? So now everything's being consolidated there. So things that were previously reviewed at institutes, T32 center grants. I think it's all now moving to CSR. That's my understanding. So where it's going to cost just as much, right, as it did at the institutes, because these are complex submissions, right? You're comparing apples to oranges, not apples to apples. So, but that's neither here nor there. the fact of the matter is you're going to have to turn to CSR to figure out what your review panel looks like, or even if you can see your review panel. There will still be instances where you may not be able to see the review panel. Sometimes there are standing SEPs where the rosters are not made available, but to the extent possible, confirm with the program officer where your application is going to be reviewed and if the roster is available so that you can look at who's on the roster. CSR does an audit every year of their study sections, which has always been true. That's not just under this administration. And they adjust them accordingly. So if they have a study section that gets tons of applications, they might split them in two and call it A and B. If they get a study section that doesn't get many applications, it might get absorbed into another one, or they might create a whole new one to take on some new topic that's coming down the pike. So and people rotate off every year, the standing study section members. So it's a moving target, who the reviewers are. Plus, they are allowed to sit out one session of 3 each year if they want to. So you're not even guaranteed that all the people on that roster are going to be in the room when your application is reviewed. Nevertheless, it pays to do your homework and ask the program officer where it's going to be reviewed and if the roster is available, and study the people on the roster so you know who your audience is very specifically. And you're citing them appropriately. The other thing is that what most people are familiar with study sections. It's your peers. They are awarding a score to the application. What most people don't know is that's the first level of review, and that's not where the money is awarded. The second level of review is at council. That's where the money is awarded. That is changing profoundly. So, and I'll describe how it's changing. So council is an advisory council to the institute director. There are 3 council meetings per year. Part of it is open to the public, and there are reporters there, and they talk about press releases and yay, the institute's great, all of that. Then there's a closed session where they talk about the business of running the institute. And in theory, the advisory council advises the institute director on budget issues and legislative issues and whatever else, patent type stuff. Like there's all kinds of stuff that they advise on. Part of the closed session is that that's where they make decisions about funding. So how this is changing is that since the dawn of time, since NIH has begun, council, the members were invited by members of the institute. So when I was a staff writer at NHGRI, we would think about who we would invite. And because it was a genome institute, we would invite people who were lawyers who did like genetic discrimination as a specialty. There were genetic counselors, there were social workers, there were people from biotech, people from pharmaceutical companies who knew something about genetic testing, people from all avenues, and community members as well. I forget if it's 1 or 2 community members who are invited to serve as well. And these nominees are put forward, and it's a pro forma thing. And if they accept, they serve. So the ones who were nominated before the current administration took office have been dismissed as being nominees under the previous administration, as if the previous administration had anything to do with these nominees. I'm sure they were unaware and didn't care who the nominees were, but they have been dismissed. So council has now gone from like 25 or 30 people to like half a dozen. And that is not an adequate number of people to judge whether an applicant should be funded. And of course, the concern is that the people who are going to be nominated to council will be put forward by the current administration and have all of the biases that the current administration that align with the goals of the current administration, shall we say, diplomatically. So there is a lot of turmoil at council, and this is something you can also ask your program officer about. I want to remind people you're not going to get these answers in an email. Program officers are not committing to this information in an email for obvious reasons. It's always been true that you get more from program officers on a call. It's never been more true than now. So So another reason to call your yet another reason to call your program officer and see what's going on at council, who they think is going to be coming on council if they know, and another reason to align with the priorities of the administration, at least in the way you're framing the project, so that if your application is coming up for discussion at council, there's nothing in it that's going to be triggering for the people who are on council. Okay, I think that was everything that came up for me pertaining to the topics you discussed.
Meg, there was a side aspect of what you just discussed that I wanted to bring up too, and I wanted to ask you to what extent you're seeing this at NIH. We're seeing it again in defense health and non-NIH HHS awards. We're seeing an additional layer of political appointee review, potentially non-scientifically trained, who are reviewing projects who have been selected for award and reviewing them to make sure they align with agency priorities before the award is actually made. And so I've been advising my clients to be aware that your at least summaries or specific aims pages really speak in a language that those individuals can understand and won't misunderstand because they're not necessarily scientifically trained. And so for folks to be aware that that layer is happening and is very influential. And we've actually seen projects come back either not funded or funding amount changed because of that review.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think that you've named most of the places where you really have to watch how you're describing your project, but that reframing language has to feature prominently in the narrative overview of the aims page, in the 30-line project summary, in the 3-sentence project narrative, digging deeper into the application in the significance and approach section. And if you've been asked for a rebuttal, I would argue that, and I talked about NIH rebuttals maybe a month ago or so. If anybody missed that session of Ask the Grant Writing Expert, it was within the last couple of sessions. You have to really feature it in the rebuttal as well. And as Burr said, none of this is new. You've always had to align with agency priorities. That's been true since the dawn of time. But man, is it true now? Like, oh my gosh, it's just a non-starter if you're not, and we've been up and down this funding roller coaster for a very long time, you and I, Burr. We've seen trends come and go. We've weathered a lot of different administrations, and this is not going to last forever. But in the meantime, you have to stay funded. You have to figure out how to navigate the next 3 years.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to give really practical advice that hopefully will be true in the short and long term. And in a way, and at least as a consultant, my job is whatever the funding landscape is, my job is to understand it and be able to advise my clients.
Right.
And I think as applicants, your job is the same. Whatever the situation is, understand it and respond as effectively as you can to it. There's a time and place for sort of, is this good or bad, or am I happy or sad about it? I'm not telling you not to have those feelings,
Right.
but what I can do in practical terms is say, okay, what are we going to do about it? And these, in my opinion, are enduring and accessible things that you can do now and in the future.
Yep. Yeah, and for those, I know there are people on this call who don't have access to my one-on-one services, and I will say that I have a staff member who is a dedicated staffer who on the daily is sifting through information that's coming out of, 25 different news sources, trying to figure out what's going on at NIH, and we are the best way to stay on top of that information coming out of my company is free. It's we put that information out as news pieces, short news pieces on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is probably the best, either my personal LinkedIn or my company LinkedIn, that we posted in both places. We also post, I think there's like a company Facebook page and one other, I forget which one, but you can tell I don't post this stuff, but probably the easiest way to keep on top of it, because we post about these things as it's happening on LinkedIn. So if you're not connected with me on LinkedIn or my company, go ahead and do that, and that will help keep you on top of these notices. We do have one question in here, and it's not related to this, but I do want to get to it before we wrap up. This person is saying, my R01 will end within 1 to 2 years, and I plan on submitting a competing renewal for the first time. Can you describe any recommendations, tips, and strategies related to competing renewals? And I'm delighted to say that this is an applicant who I've known across 2 organizations, and I knew her back when she was a K applicant. So I'm delighted to hear you're up to your competing renewal. So I covered that topic at previous AGE sessions, and you should have access to that through your membership. The sessions were June 28th, 2023 and February 8th, 2023. And my advice is the same. You'll see there that my personal preference for how to write a competing renewal is to include the progress report at the beginning of the approach section and do it as a table where you write the aim of the original application, your progress on that aim, and your publications on that aim. So the rows are the aims and the columns are what the aim was, what your progress on the aim is, and then the far right column would be the publications. I also really like, and I should probably redo this mini tutorial because I've started doing something on the aims page. On the aims page, I really like if you give the context for the project and then say original R01 and describe what the aims were and what you've done on that, new data, and then proposed project. So you have 4 headers leading into the aims page. So, but I'm getting asked this question a lot, so I think I'm going to do another mini tutorial on that soon. Hopefully that's helpful. And there's another question. I have an R21 first submission discussed 50%. Recently just see the results for the second submission, score 45, 35%. That's improved. I guess I cannot get funded based on the previous program officer said maybe 10% usually gets funded. However, I just wish to know if there is a possibility. Initially, I talked to the division director. She said my grant is unique and no one has done that before. Later, my grant was assigned to another program officer at her division as she specialized in this area. I wonder if I could possibly talk to the director to seek any possible interest from her. I do not know how the council meeting will decide because I have not seen the summary statement, but even last time of the reviewer gives a bad score is really not so critical a point. So I would say, do you know what the numeric score was on that R21? If you know, let me know. But my guess is it's a 45. The score is a 45. I don't think in my entire career I've seen an R21 with a 45 get funded. I don't think that is anywhere near the fundable range. You're looking at typically in the 20s or even lower. Like in advance of, I should say that there's actually some tentatively good news on the funding front, which I'll talk about in a minute. But when the administration proposed cutting the NIH budget by 40%, NCI promptly published new funding lines for FY26, saying they were going down to 4% on their R01s. I think it was premature because we don't know what the funding bill will be. But all of which is to say I don't see a 45 being funded. However, you piqued my curiosity by saying that it was something unique. And I wonder if this is the right mechanism for you. I wonder if you should gather a little more data and consider looking at the high risk, high reward mechanisms. And before you say, but the funding lines are even worse on those, I will tell you that I just had somebody funded on a transformative R01 who has been triaged on traditional R01s for years. So this is a person who came to me about a year ago, and he's doing one of these like systems approaches. That is, I can't discuss it, but it's like a cross-cutting systems approach to studying brain disorders. And traditional R01s, he just was triaged again, again, and again, and again. And I suggested that he look at the high risk, high reward portfolio, and specifically the TR01. Um, so, and he spoke with the program officer. They were very interested. He applied. He was asked for a rebuttal letter, and I just found out a few weeks ago that he was funded. So here's a guy where on a traditional R01, he was triaged repeatedly and applies for a mechanism that has way worse funding lines than traditional R01s, and he gets funded on that. So,
Meg,
yeah,
I just wanted to jump in and say that I've seen this a lot. People beat their head against the wall on the R01s,
yeah,
and there are practical reasons why, like, you're just sort of behind the eight ball with an R01.
yeah.
And looking at different funding opportunities outside of the R01 world is a terrific, terrific suggestion. I had another client similar to you, Meg, for different situation. They ended up getting funded through a contract solicitation instead of a grant.
Wow.
Anyway, the
Yeah.
point is, be creative. I mentioned you might have to look at different agencies, but I should add to that, you might have to look at different mechanisms too, because the R01 isn't for every research project.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and so the person is saying, what kind of mechanism could you specify? There are four high risk, high reward mechanisms, and they have to do with your career stage and your, I think the amount of preliminary data is part of it too, and whether you're an individual or a team. So they're the transformative R01, the DP2, the DP5, and the Pioneer Award. So if you just do an internet search on NIH high risk, high reward, the page will pop up and you can read which one might be um, a good fit for you. And you could just reach out to a program officer at one or two of those and see if your project idea might be a fit for that mechanism. So, and the person also asked, the guest speaker mentioned that the funding might be not be a straight cutoff on the score. That's always been true at NIH. So, for the first time, I've actually seen it given a name. NIBIB has a web page up now that calls it the expanded zone of opportunity or some doublespeak nonsense like that. But it's always been true that program officers and council members can handpick from among, I mean, they're not going to fund something if, like it's got a 45th percentile or so, like an R01. But if you're like within spitting distance of the funding line, like they might handpick yours because it's a better match to their mission. The other thing is that program officers have access to a funding mechanism called the R56, which you can't apply to as an outsider, but that they can award you to give you, it's like bridge funding, and I think it's a year, if I remember. And it's meant to help you beef up your preliminary data and come in with a stronger R01 application a year later, because the PO loves you and they love the project and they want to see you get funded, and it aligns perfectly with the institute priorities at that time. Yet another of the very many reasons to build a relationship with the program officer and do your diligence about what they're identifying as their funding priorities at this time, which are changing.
I think that's an important message for everyone to hear, though, that in my opinion, it has always been true that agency alignment is a factor that's being considered in addition to just straight score. I
Yep.
think it's even more true now. I think they're reaching a little farther maybe
Mhm.
than they did in the past. And agency alignment and funding priority alignment is even more important. So I think many researchers think that that score is the determinant, and it is a part of it, but it's still a big part of it, but it's not as big of a part of it maybe as it used to be.
Right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that if you don't get past the three assigned reviewers to even be discussed at study section, you're sunk. And if you tank at study section and get a really bad score, that's it. But you could receive, something, let's say the funding line is 12% and you're up around 15%. You could still get a just-in-time request. You could be discussed at council. They might hand select it. So, it really pays, it just gives you that little bit of extra leverage if you're in that gray zone, whatever like I actually got worried when I saw the expanded zone of opportunity because I thought, oh, here we go. Like this is going to be the excuse for council members to fund things that have terrible scores, you know, even though because they align with the agency priorities. But so far I haven't seen that happen.
For those of you who do apply in the defense world, 100% that happens. You get program officers who have, for lack of a better term, pet projects, and they just make sure that those folks get funded. It
Yeah,
definitely happens.
yeah,
The
I've
peer
seen.
review, it almost makes me wonder, like, why did you bring in peer reviewers? You didn't listen to
Yeah,
them at all.
yeah.
So
I mean,
that is a reality in some places.
yeah, I will say at NIH, you have to have a reasonable score even to get in the game. But I've seen program officers absolutely go to the mats for an applicant or a project they really believe in.
And
Um,
by the way, just because you got a low score doesn't mean that it's a bad project. The program manager might be going to bat for 100% legitimate reasons. I didn't mean to sound like or didn't mean to imply that low score means bad project. And if a program manager advocates for it, it's for nefarious reasons. No, you could have a meritorious project that just found a reviewer that
right.
you've seen reviews that you didn't necessarily agree with, that didn't get it
Everybody
right in your
has.
opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, everybody has. We have time for one more question, then we're going to wrap up because we're already over time. If you were applying for a NOSI, Notice of Special Interest, can you be reasonably assured that you are responding to Institute's funding priorities? That's a really good question, and I would say that that is one piece of it. So a NOSI is, the problem at NIH is that so much of the extramural funding goes out under investigator-initiated NOFOs, where there's no topic, right? So you're kind of left thinking like, well, what are their funding priorities? And like Burr talked about some ways to figure that out. And of course, I go through that quite a bit in chapter 1 of Master the R series. And a NOSI does have a topic. A NOSI does have a topic. So you are responding to that aspect of the Institute's priorities, but it's bigger than that. I think you really have to stay on top of the rhetoric that's coming out of NIH right now. I think you have to talk to your program officer and show them an aims page and say, I know this is responsive to the NOSI. However, I know there's more to it than that, and your institute has funding priorities, and that's in a state of flux. Can you help me determine if the Ames page is responsive to what your current understanding is of your institute's funding priorities?
And then, Meg, let me kind of cut to the chase. How many times have you talked to a program officer who said, I know the NOSI says this, but those last 5 bullets aren't really what we're looking for. They made it in there,
Right.
but really we want this.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Which is again why it pays to talk to them. It really pays to talk to them because you get more information. So, but great question. All right, we're going to wrap up because we're 10 minutes over. We used to do this in half an hour, then it was 45 minutes. I think I'm going to have to expand it to an hour because we're getting a lot of good conversation and questions coming in. Burr, always a delight to see you. We'll have to get together for a virtual lunch or coffee sometime since we're in different parts of the country. I know that our audience really appreciates your input. Yeah, and we're getting some love back in the Q&A and the emojis. So um, thank you so much, and I'll talk to you soon. And I hope to see you back on here sometime.
Absolutely. I enjoy doing this. Thank you very much. And everyone who attended, thank you. And hopefully we'll have a chance to do it again soon.
Yeah, and we're rooting for you. And as the French would say, courage. So hang in there, everybody, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.